Welcome to the Practice Discipleship Initiative webinar series. My name is Dawn Troutman. I am your host throughout this series, and today I'm coming to you from the Virginia Synod of the ELCA. And you can find out more about me at LutheranLifeCoach.com. This initiative is a dynamic partnership between the ELCA Youth Ministry Network, the ELCA and its youth gathering, and ELCA seminaries and colleges. Practice Discipleship offers leadership development for the sake of faith formation, and this year's theme is Frame. There will be a series of 6 webinars that focus on Lutheran theology, ministry theory, and practical skills relating to our theme. Today's webinar is titled Framing Failure with Forgiveness. Our presenter today is Reverend Dr. Colleen Windham-Hughes, and she is the Assistant Professor of Religion at California Lutheran University in Thousand Oaks, California. So you will be able to interact with Colleen and ask questions as we go along. So if you look at the right side of your computer screen, you'll see a box where you can type questions into the chat. When you do that, I will repeat them so that they're on the broadcast and everybody else knows what you asked, and then Colleen will be able to answer your questions. So please keep an eye both when we may ask for comments, and also you are definitely invited to jump in with questions at any point during the presentation. So let's get to it. Welcome, Colleen.
Thank you so much, Dawn. Good to be with you.
Yes, well, let's jump in. I'm very excited to give as much time as possible to this topic.
Well, fantastic. It's not a very easy topic, especially with a phrase like failure is not an option coming to us from almost every corner of our culture and in our society. This idea that failure is not an option comes to us in government settings, in educational settings, in movie voiceovers, with this big, deep voice, failure is not an option. Right. And it's supposed to be motivational or something, right? Bring out your best, and maybe in some cases it does, right? But it also gives us this idea that it's not possible to fail, that we can't acknowledge failure. And so with this idea that failure is not an option, we end up having all sorts of responses to failure, like ignoring it, just pretending that it isn't there and framing it out of the picture of our daily lives, or spinning it, right? It wasn't really failure, it was success by another measure. Mm-hmm. Or framing it out of our lives and completely blaming somebody else and making it their entire frame. Well, this is a failed project, a failed person, a failed marriage, a failed student. Or punishing just one person. We know this one, it's old, this scapegoat method, right? Mm-hmm. So there are all sorts of ways that we respond to failure by framing it out of our everyday picture or making it the sum total of our or somebody else's everyday picture. And then there's that most insidious of Christian responses to failure, which is the make nice option. Right? Just smooth it over, pretend like it never happened. So we have all of these responses interpersonally to failure that either make it out of our frame or frame somebody else with it. And then, of course, if we don't deal with it interpersonally, we're dealing with it personally. So that when we say failure is not an option, we're giving individuals who feel like failures no choice but to deal with it themselves, and they do, by cutting themselves, by using, by drinking, by all sorts of other ways of acknowledging the failure to themselves because they can't in a larger society. So today's topic is a tough one, but we have to talk about it because while it might be true that failure is not an option in that we don't choose it, nobody, I think, ever opts in to failure. Right. It does happen, right?
It's going to happen, yes.
It's going to happen. And when we say failure is not an option, what's happening is not only are we afraid to fail, we think it possible not to fail. So we thought it'd be good in this year's Practice Discipleship initiative to look at how failure is framed in society and how failure is framed in the Bible, what Jesus does with failure, and what forgiveness might actually be as a practice. And so over the course of the next bit or so, we're going to look at a couple of instances of failure. And we're going to be trying to look at what does failure look like in the Bible, how is it acknowledged, and what is the path forward. So we'll start with an episode of personal failure, one of the most famous from Paul. Now this is one of those scripture readings that you never want to be the liturgist for because it's hard to read, right? But it's classic Paul and classic on personal failure. I do not understand my own actions, for I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing I hate. Now, if I do what I do not want, I agree that the law is good, but in fact it is no longer I that do it, but sin that dwells within me. For I know that nothing good dwells within me, that is, in my flesh. I can will what is right, but I cannot do it. For I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I do. Now if I do what I do not want, it is no longer I that do it, but sin that dwells within me. Look at this language. Sin that dwells within me. Nothing good dwells within me. Sin dwells within me. This is a deep sense of personal failure, of the idea that no matter what he does, it won't be good. It will be a failure. And this, for Paul, is of course related to his discussion of law and gospel, of sin and grace, but is one of the deepest and most honest acknowledgments of personal failure I've ever come across anywhere. Now, he names that failure, honestly. He acknowledges that he even doesn't understand where it comes from, that it springs up within him almost beyond his control. And then he names what the path forward is for him. And it's not his own strength, it's Jesus. So in the very next chapter, he writes, "There is therefore now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus." So when we talk about failure and forgiveness, we have to talk about Jesus and the tremendous ministry that he had with real people. And I think if we look at it honestly, we're not going to see the cultural narrative repeated, as though Jesus is approaching people, the woman at the well and others, and saying, failure is not an option. No, nor is he going to respond to them in the way Christians often do, either by blaming or by making nice. Rather, he's going to call it out. We do fail. There are sinners. But here's the good news. I did not come to call the righteous, Jesus said in Matthew, but sinners. And so in thinking about Jesus and talking about Jesus, I find it really helpful sometimes to read what non-Christians have to say about Jesus. So that's where I'm going to take us next. Because non-Christians sometimes have a perspective on Jesus and on Christianity that we need to hear. And this is one of the most life-giving perspectives on Jesus and on what it means to be a Christian that I've ever come across. It comes from Hannah Arendt, who's a 20th century philosopher. And she was a secular Jew, but she had such an appreciation for Jesus and what Jesus did. And she said that his major gift to human history was pointing out the role of forgiveness in personal and communal life. So here's what she wrote about forgiveness. Without being forgiven, released from the consequences of what we have done, our capacity to act would, as it were, be confined to one single deed from which we could never recover. We would remain the victims of its consequences forever. See, Hannah Arendt was not afraid to talk about the kinds of failures that we do individually and interpersonally. And she saw that what failures did was start a chain of consequences that would head toward ruin if left unchecked. So those times we wound one another and we let those wounds fester, if left unchecked, those consequences then get woven into individual and interpersonal relationships. They become a life script. They become the frame. So she said that forgiveness is actually a release from those consequences, an opportunity to move forward and begin again, to act again. So it's not pretending like things never happened, that there are no consequences, but it is saying there is yet good to be done here. There is yet action that can come from this. There is a new beginning.
And if you're listening along...
So she looks at...
Oh, go ahead. I was just going to fill the gap. Keep going, Colleen.
So she looks at Jesus, and she tries to name what Jesus does. Jesus expresses the reality of failure. It happens. Jesus releases people from the consequences of that one act so that it doesn't define or frame their entire existence. Then Jesus works to restore the relationship. And then Jesus tries to help the person rejoin community. So for Hannah Arendt then, learning from how Jesus spent time with people, she wrote that forgiveness is the only action that acts anew, almost interrupting our pattern of failure or the consequences of hurt with one another. And Jesus pointed out that even as forgiveness is God's work, it's very much also human work. Forgiveness is both God's work and human work. So what would it mean to look at forgiveness as a practice? And here's our first glimpse into this. Because I think forgiveness doesn't include everything that we sometimes think it does, like forgetting. It's really hard to forget when we've been wounded or we've wounded someone else. Forgiveness as a practice does not, I think, involve forgetting. But nor, I think, does forgiveness as a practice immediately involve reconciliation. In order for the relationship to really be reconciled, there have to be other moments of healing and other moments of intentionality. So if we focus on forgiveness as a practice that acts anew, to offer a new beginning, we can look first at the Lord's Prayer, a prayer that we know by heart, that we say often, and perhaps sometimes unthinkingly. But if we take it petition by petition and notice just for a minute where forgiveness falls in our Lord's Prayer, we can also pause on Martin Luther's teaching of it and notice that forgiveness is right by daily bread. In some cases, an extension of that very same sentence. So the need for and the practice of forgiveness is just as important to us as our daily bread. So forgiveness isn't some crazy, unusual practice that happens only in extreme circumstances. It's actually much closer to a daily practice of releasing people from consequences of their actions and their behaviors. You see, here's the main thing about forgiveness. As a practice, it's not actually about feeling better. It's really about living together and making room for each person to express him or herself in word and deed, to be able to live together in a community and not be defined, not be framed by those actions, those missteps, those failures that we sometimes think would define us. You ready for a story, Dawn?
I am. I have all sorts of questions in my head, so I'm so ready for a story.
All right. So I'm wearing what was my grandfather's signature scent today. It's Chapstick Original, you know, the one in the black package.
Yes.
Every time I open it, I think of my grandfather. And my grandfather is somebody who was a failure by some worldly successes. He was never able to make much of any of his businesses, and he was married and raising children in the Depression. And my grandmother, thankfully, was a wildfire and very resourceful, so she would sell vacuums and World Book encyclopedias and all sorts of things to keep the family afloat. But one of his businesses was an electronics store, and he sold some of the very first TVs in the town.
Wow.
Yeah, and his store was on the main street of the town, and he would turn on TVs and have them facing the main street, and people would gather and watch the TVs out there on the boulevard. And then, as you might imagine, people would sometimes invest a great deal of money in buying one of these newfangled objects. Well, they didn't always have the money to support it, so one of the things my grandfather had to do was repossession. And my father went with him on some of those trips as a boy. They'd have to borrow a truck, and they'd have to drive out to one of their neighbors' homes to take back one of those new televisions that the family couldn't afford. And that would have been an opportunity to condemn an ill spending of money or make judgments on people. But instead, what my dad talks about in those moments, both in the ride-up in the car and in how my grandfather interacted with those neighbors who might be deemed failures with how they were spending their money, is he would affirm their dignity and underline the contributions that they were making to the community. So he would point out, well, you know, Henry is a very hard worker, and you know, he helped to build the building over there on that street, and now there's a family that lives there, and we can really appreciate what Henry did for the community. Or, well, Sarah is a really wonderful teacher, and she didn't teach you, but she taught some of your cousins, and we can be really grateful for what Sarah contributed to the community. What my grandfather was doing for those people was offering a new path forward. So not condemning them to be a failure, boxing them in a frame as irresponsible, but saying, good will come out of you yet. Yes, there is failure, and there are consequences because of that. The TV has to be repossessed, and yet there is a path forward. There is a new beginning. There is a place for you in the community. So I want to try just shifting the frame from a picture frame sort of idea in which we don't want to see any failures inside of it. We don't want to see any blemishes. We want it photoshopped, a perfect day, a perfect picture. I want to try to get us to shift from that to framing a path. Because if you frame a path, you actually can't see all the places that it will go. And there'll be risings and fallings in it. There will be navigating around rocks or scrabble or mud, and it won't all be perfect, but it will all offer space to move, space for people to act. And so in light of this idea of framing a path, I want to offer that the practice of forgiveness is a practice of giving. And what it's giving is a path forward and a new beginning.
Wonderful. Rod has a question for you. It fits exactly what you're saying. Bonhoeffer said that forgiveness is the cross that the Christian is called to carry. It seems that because we are forgiven, it is our responsibility to forgive. What do you think of those two statements?
Yes, I think that's exactly right. The Lord's Prayer makes it really clear that our forgiveness of others is linked to God's forgiveness of us. Some would even go so far as to say it's a condition. I'm not sure about that. It would be fun to sit and have some discussion and some Bible study about the conditionality of it. But definitely we are able to forgive others because God forgives us, and we are called to forgive others because God forgives us. And it is for sure the gift of Jesus' life and death on a cross and resurrection that showed us that in the first place.
I think, yes. The powerful thing about your story is the consequences were real and the TV was taken away, but that doesn't define the person, that doesn't define how they are in the community and what they will contribute in the future.
Exactly. What my grandfather understood was that he was going to have to see those people again, perhaps in the store again, and that in the grocery store, right, and at school, and maybe even at church. So he wasn't going to be able to ignore it, and they weren't going to be able to pretend it didn't happen. They couldn't spin it. What they had to do was acknowledge it and then try to look at a path forward. You know, this also maybe is an opportunity to talk about something I really believe deeply, that might also be an occasion for some more questions from Rod or someone else. But I actually think we can't forgive ourselves. So there's this cultural wisdom that you have to forgive yourself. And I don't really think that's possible, actually. I think that forgiveness has to happen in relationship. So God can forgive us and other people can forgive us. I'm not sure we can forgive ourselves. So that means even more that we are made for relationship and made for a community with God and with other people. And it makes it all the more important to practice forgiveness as a giving of a path forward, even as a giving of self, in which you limit to some extent the leverage you could get out of somebody's mistake or pain, and you try within your very human parameters to begin again. So I've got just a couple of other brief moments about failure and forgiveness in the Bible that I think it's worth sharing.
Good.
And they challenge us a little bit. So the next one is really very directly about interpersonal failure and forgiveness. And it's very early in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5. And he's talking about, you know, in Matthew 5, he's really addressing the Torah and the commandments that are given against murder and all sorts of things. And then he's also offering his teaching. And his teaching, just as Hannah Arendt pointed out, was very on-the-ground, daily reality, real stuff teaching, right? So the law and how it's applied. And so what Jesus taught in Matthew 5 is this: when you're offering your gift at the altar, if you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First, be reconciled to your brother or sister, and then come and offer your gift. Whoa. This is a tough one. You know, I was actually in a worship service once in seminary in which the preacher of the day asked us to do this. He said, you know, we've got Eucharist planned for today, and we usually sing a hymn before Eucharist, but today I'm going to ask you not to sing. We're going to play some music, and what I want you to do is go to your brother and sister and acknowledge any sources of pain that are in the community. Can you imagine what worship would be like if we did that on any kind of regular basis?
Wow.
It was a little bit awkward, I have to say.
Right. I'm thinking it would be super awkward.
But people did it. He said in advance, I know you're not going to solve anything here in these next few minutes of the musical interlude. But what you're going to do is you're going to acknowledge that there's something between you, and you're going to make some kind of commitment in a worship setting to dedicate this relationship to prayer, to acknowledge that there's something between you and that you're sharing this table together, and then to figure out what it would mean to begin again with each other. You know, I think Jesus really meant it, and it's wild, isn't it, that sometimes God wants our relationships with one another to be before our worship, right? Or even part of our worship. And really, if we can't acknowledge the pain in our interpersonal relationships in worship, where will we acknowledge it? And so I have these questions. Can you praise God if you're fighting with a friend? And what does it feel like to do so? So if you pass by somebody you're having an argument with or you've got deep pain with on your way into church, and then you take up your different seats away from each other, and then you start singing and you start praying and you get ready for Eucharist, what does that feel like? How do you balance those things? And do our friendships have anything to do with God? I think we have to say that if you're Christian, it doesn't mean that all of your relationships will go well, right? So if nothing else, let this session be that, right? That Christians are not perfect, are not always nice, and we'll fail with one another.
And Mary wrote, this kind of refers to what you were talking about 5 minutes ago, but fits here as well. She said, I kind of agree with the statement, we can't forgive ourselves, but we really must lean on God's forgiveness. So thanks for jumping in, Mary.
Yes, thank you, Mary, so much. You know, when we think we have to rely on ourselves, we attribute strength to us that we don't have. And we think we live in a world of one. And we don't, really. God made us, and God made us with other people. So it's really critical that we lean on the strength of God and that we let God come to us in the face and the actions of our sisters and brothers.
And Mary followed up with, in answer to your question, that personally, she finds the moment of confession and forgiveness as a time when she realizes there are areas of her life that she's ignored the need for mending and forgiveness. Thank you, Mary. And then Rod wrote, sometimes I mistake forgiving myself with receiving God's forgiveness. When I resist forgiveness and hold on to my sins and beat myself up about it, it feels like I need to forgive myself. This is self-centered and leads me to begin thinking I need to forgive myself when I really need to acknowledge God's forgiveness. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much. And, you know, I have to call us out a little bit because we Protestants, we're really good at that particular sin that Rod just named. So we say that there's nothing we can do to earn God's grace, and it's all from God. And then we beat ourselves up all over the place for not living up to or living out of the grace that we were given. And it's a different kind of prioritizing of the self, not in the merit column, but in the demerit column, right?
Yes.
Yeah, but it's still a focus on self, and it's really hard to find your own way forward. And it's God who offers that to us, and others who name that for us. So
powerful.
It is. what a mighty God we serve, and what an amazing thing that our God came in the flesh and lived this life and showed us that we would be part of this impossible, amazing gift of grace that is forgiveness. So the last category, maybe some people will feel like a stretch or maybe will resist, but I think we have to say that as people of faith, we are sometimes called to call out social failure as well, the way that we as a group can fail each other, and to name the patterns and the institutions and the interactions that aren't going well. And so I've chosen a story from Nehemiah. Maybe a lot of people haven't read Nehemiah before, and maybe you'll be wanting to do so after this. Nehemiah is writing at a time when people are trying to reclaim and rebuild what has been lost and what's destroyed for them. And so they're finding their way into living with one another again. But they're building after disaster. And when disaster happens, people perhaps quite rightly focus on their own survival and can kind of neglect others, right? Look, I'm just doing what I can to survive. I've got to feed my family. I've got to pay my rent. I've got to keep shelter over my head. And forgetting that we live in these communities together. And I won't recount the whole story of Nehemiah 5 here, but I'll just pull out a few things that he says to acknowledge the failure that's going on in his community. What's happened is that people, in order to become successful, have really pretty much enslaved their neighbors, getting them to work for them, or have raised the prices of goods that are really necessary for life, oil and grapes and different things like that. And Nehemiah says to them, the thing that you are doing is not good. And I love this because I often don't know where to begin when I am frustrated and feel like the frustration is rooted in the sense of God's justice for our lives with each other.
Yes.
And so starting with the thing that you are doing is not good is just simple talk that I think I can do. I can start there, right?
Right.
This does not seem good. Should you not walk in the fear of our God to prevent the taunts of the nations, our enemies? Now, I know we don't like to talk about this enemy talk, but the truth is that, especially in our global political context, this is how we talk about people. And again, we've got values being played out differently in global society. And it's a big question about what role our faith plays in our society and how much nations are shaped by faith. The situation was different for Nehemiah because the community there was both a political community and a faithful community. But nevertheless, even though our circumstances are different, I think it's incumbent upon us as people of faith to be able to call out these issues of human dignity, of how we treat our neighbors, and how we prioritize our own survival, our own success on the backs of others. And then he says, more boldly and more clearly perhaps than his first language of what you are doing is not good. He says, restore to them this very day their fields, their vineyards, their olive orchards, and their houses, and the interest on money, grain, wine, and oil that you have been exacting from them. So if the first one is naming the failure, acknowledging it, saying it's not good, trying to interrupt it from all of its consequences, the second one is trying to offer a path forward. Not just you've done these terrible things and condemning people, but saying there is another way. There is a new action. There is a new beginning for your neighbors you've been neglecting, but also for you, that you can engage in this act of restoring to your neighbors what belongs to them. in our lives together in Christian community, and especially working with children and youth, how life-giving is this? To say first, what you're doing is not good. And then to say second, restore to those around you. Act anew. Don't be defined by this moment of failure. Don't be framed in by it, and don't let others frame you out. But act again. Interrupt that moment of failure. Restore to others what you've taken from them, and let others forgive you.
So this may be a good time. There's a couple different questions, but I'm going to start with Barbara, who asked, how do we frame these conversations in the face of abuse?
Yes, really tough one. Because what you have to do in abuse, first of all, is look to safety, right?
Right.
And so these ideas of forgiveness are definitely not meant to ignore wrongdoing or even substitute for legal action. And we can certainly look back to Jesus' story, but we can also look back to Hannah Arendt's own conditions, and she's writing after World War II. So she's certainly not trying to write blindly or ignorantly about forgiveness, and she certainly believed very strongly in the importance of legal trials for people who had engaged in wrongdoing. I think in abuse and in the people that I've known with abuse, the first step is not forgiveness. The first step is interrupting the abuse and
Yes.
working for the safety of the people. And perhaps here it's helpful to think just for a minute not about the victim of the abuse, but of the community that is around both the victim and the perpetrator of abuse. So, and both people belong to the community, both the victim and the perpetrator. And it's hard maybe to think about how you relate to an abuser. They need to be punished for what they've done. They need to be taken away from the situation of abuse. And yet, is it right for their entire lives to be framed by that abuse? That's a tough one for us. And there's nobody who gives a stronger witness in this regard than the Amish. There's this book about, there's this book about the Amish called Amazing Grace. Do you know this, Dawn?
I don't, but
stories about the Amish?
No, but I just know of their shunning and some of their very strong practices.
Yeah, and what I was thinking was not so much on that side. That is important, especially in the worshiping community. I was thinking about their response to the shooter at Nickel Mines. So the man who came into the schoolhouse and shot students and then himself. And they, of course, were devastated beyond belief. Their community was ruptured unbelievably and irreversibly. So there's no denying that there were consequences and the world was ripped open for them. And yet, in a matter of hours, representatives from the community went to offer a greeting in person to the shooter's wife to say, this is not the end of you. This is not what defines you or our community. And we, out of our faith, release you from the consequences of being this person's wife in this moment. And for them, it is not reconciliation. Forgiveness is really only a release from consequences and an acknowledgement that people are still sharing in the same community with one another. So in this case, forgiveness is not the dusting off, the end of the process, the moment for everybody to forget. It's actually the first movement past, the initial pain and the initial emergency. It's the first movement out of community to say our faith calls us to be in person together and to say that though we don't understand it, there will be a way forward for our community. And the book goes through this episode in many pages, right? So it's not easy, and there are many tears and arguments with the community, and of course still legal proceedings and all sorts of ways that Christian practice comes up against the legal system. And yet there's something really powerful about people being formed in faith, saying forgiveness is not just a nice idea and not a Hallmark card. It is a gift of God in the power of God, and we don't understand it, and it's impossible, and yet we experience it from God, and we're called to offer it to others.
Wonderful. I want to move on to Deb's question. These have been great, great answers. Thank you, Colleen. How do you respond to someone after you've already told them that forgiveness comes from God, yet they persist in the conviction that forgiveness is not available to them because they cannot forgive themselves?
I honestly would say you're right. You can't forgive yourself.
Right answer. Yes.
Right. So where do you find the strength to risk yourself again, to risk being in company with others, saying what you believe and acting on your convictions? You get that strength from God and from the community. If you're looking for it in yourself, I don't think you'll find it. I think it's the sure way to ruin.
Thank you. And then Mary said, how much of our society's unwillingness to fail has a financial price tag someone is trying to avoid with paying courts and judgment?
Oh, wow. Oh, yes. Well, finances are involved in many aspects of our society right now, as though that is the chief thing that defines us in life, right, Mary? Economics and finances are a really tough part about this, but notice that even in the Lord's Prayer, forgiveness is often understood in a monetary way in terms of talking about debts and debtors and different things like that. So even though we have some unique financial conditions now, there's a sense in which there's some biblical precedent for thinking about our interactions with others in monetary terms. And so here's, I think, what money can do for us in a situation like this. It's an object that we've made where we can make piles of it and we can take piles away, and we can see very physically and objectively how much is where, right?
Right.
Now, what happens if we make that translation spiritually? Can we think about the room that we're giving to people for them to act, right? For them to make mistakes, for them to say things? Maybe if we could give that some physical space, some pile, or see when we are restricting the space so that there is no room to act, that's where finances can help us. But I think to go back to Mary's point about financial failures, we had with the banks, too big to fail and that sort of thing. And that seems to be an effort to save everybody's pocketbooks. And yet fundamentally, the sentiment is insulting, right?
Right.
Too big to fail. Right. Okay. Well, I don't think that helps. I don't think that helps us very much.
Right. So those of you interested in the book Amazing Grace that Colleen was talking about, the link to it will be on the Practice Discipleship Facebook page. I don't think it's there at this moment, but it will be within hours. Our great team behind the scenes is always right on top of that kind of thing, and they let me know that they're going to put that up. And then Kimberly actually heard the nickel mine shooter's wife speak this morning at an event. So how crazy is that in Fargo? So yeah, Kimberly reports that the wife of the shooter talked about the power of the forgiveness extended by the Amish men. She said that their outreach helped stop the wall of guilt and shame that was starting to descend on her as a result of her husband's actions.
Right.
So thank you.
Thank you so much, Kimberly. And that's that release from consequences that we're talking about. The wife of the shooter used the language of that wall of shame and guilt, right? And
yes.
what she's feeling is that boxing in and that framing that she is going to be defined and framed forever by the failures of her husband, right? And what the Amish men did, even without understanding it and even in their deep pain, was say it isn't a wall of shame or a framing in of this forgiveness. It's a path forward, even though we don't know what it looks like, and there could be snares ahead.
Thank you. Should we keep moving for now?
I think so. And I have just a few more slides here, and then I will make a couple of other reading suggestions.
Great. Thank you.
Since we brought up Amish grace.
Yes.
So this is really the closing in which I have a chance to say again that forgiveness, I think, is a practice of giving. You know, the ELCA has defined these 7 faith practices, and giving is one of them. And it might be easiest to think of giving money, and maybe just as easy to think of giving our talents or our spiritual gifts or something like that. But I think forgiveness is also a practice of giving. It is giving a new beginning. It's an action that acts anew, that interrupts the consequences, the walls of shame and guilt. It is both God's work and human work. And in this practice of giving, what you give is yourself, something like your own commitment to be in community with people who have wronged you or made a mistake. It is in which you give yourself over to a new beginning with people, even though you don't know what will happen if you travel down that path. And I guess at another time we could maybe talk about the practice of receiving forgiveness too. All right, well, how can you give yourself in this kind of practice? And here are just some ways to get started. You could write a note to someone that would first acknowledge failure in your relationship. So stop ignoring it or covering it over or making nice. Acknowledge the failure and express your commitment to begin again, even if you don't understand what that is. And we can also slow down the Lord's Prayer and picture people's faces while we pray the Lord's Prayer, so that just as in the daily way that we need bread, we can daily let go of even the small stuff, even those little workplace squabbles or family arguments in which we start to box each other in and define ourselves by failure or pretend it doesn't exist. All right, so in working with children and youth, I think the book that offers the theology for this is God Bearing Life by Kenda Creasy-Dean and Ron Foster. It's been around for a while, but it's just a go-to book about how the incarnation, so the gift of Jesus, is both unique to Jesus and then shows up in our relationships with one another. And they're very clear that the job of Messiah is taken. Right? I have a colleague here on the hall who likes to say there's good news and better news. The good news is there's a Messiah. The better news, it's not you.
Right.
And so that Jesus offers himself in unique ways and the grace of God in unique ways, and yet as Christians, so little Christs, we point to the reality of Christ's grace in our lives, and we live out of that and then end up as witnesses one to another, and that this way of living really enables people to become agents. It really offers the space for children and youth and even for adults to risk themselves in language and to act together toward the kingdom of God. And then there's a companion book with God-Bearing Life called Soul Tending, which is life-forming practices for older youth and young adults. Mm-hmm. And one of the practices in there is forgiveness. And there are lots of others. But these are ways to enter into spiritual practice with one another and to try to reclaim some terms that are thrown around in rather different ways in our culture than they are in the Bible.
And these are both Kenda Casey Dean, right?
They're both Kenda Casey Dean, yes.
Great. So we'll have those links up for you as well in a matter of moments. The Amish Grace one is already there, and those will come as well. Thank you for giving us more resources.
Well, you're welcome. Always need something to read, right?
Absolutely. And I have read the first of those two. It's so, so good. I'll back you up that it's so helpful.
Yeah, it's a go-to one. So, Dawn, that's what I got for failure and forgiveness today. It's a hard topic and certainly hard to sustain conversation about it, but so, so important to be honest about failure in our everyday life and about ways we can respond as Christians to it and what forgiveness might actually mean, not in a perfunctory way or a Hallmark card way or a forgetting kind of way, but a spiritual practice that really is a commitment to a new beginning and to trusting God as well as relationship together.
So we are the ELCA Youth Ministry Network and the Gathering and other supporting bodies. How do you say all this to a 7th grade boy? How do you teach forgiveness and some of these practices? Like you can have, a 7th grade boy could picture the person they need to forgive while they're saying the Lord's Prayer. They could write a note. Are there other things that would really be helpful with sort of our prototypical audience?
Well, my husband teaches 7th grade boys.
Oh, perfect.
Yep. And so he's got language to name failures. So he says, "You messed up, dude." Right?
Yes.
So there's a sense in which we think that the best way to foster the lives of children and youth sometimes is to try to spin everything that they do into something good. Well, it's not all good, right?
Right.
And I think, even with my emerging into teenage son, sometimes I start right there with him. This is not good, right? This is not great. Let's stop and talk about this. And so I think very much just naming it in the moment and interrupting it, and then also very quickly moving to the next thing, which is what's the path forward from this, right? Let's work together on the path forward from this. And, I think they get it, and I think they appreciate it. They're pushing on us, trying to find the boundaries of life and trying to live in this crazy world. And if we're honest, the things that we face are not really very different from the things that they face. And yet that doesn't always come across as good news to them. But what they want sometimes is very much a narrative about how life can be hard and about how you can still get up the next day and have a new day and start again, even when life has been hard and you've made terrible choices.
So this really pushes against maybe that prevailing culture of self-esteem and, backing kids up at all costs and the good jobs that are constant that is sort of in the parenting culture right now.
It really does. And the thing is, they don't buy it. So they know that all the self-esteem stuff is a package around them and they don't feel it in themselves. So there's this disconnect between the sort of packaged self-esteem they get and how they feel about themselves. So that's why they cut sometimes, why they wound themselves or why they do other things or why they don't know how to process when they make a mistake or they fail. They actually need us to be really honest about how hard it is to be human sometimes and that it isn't all good and that saying that it's not all good won't make it happen. It won't make somebody mess up more. Rather, it will meet them where they are, where they feel themselves to be, and it will help them make sense of and narrate the world for themselves in more real and honest ways.
Wonderful. Thank you. Do you have any closing comments before we wrap it up here?
Closing comments about forgiveness. You know,
Yeah.
it's not easy. We're called to it. Try it.
Oh, those are good. We could put them on a t-shirt.
We'll talk to oldlutheran.com about that.
Yes, we will. So we do have the book links on the Facebook page, so you can go there. And don't go away, Colleen. There's actually one more question coming in. I can see it being typed. But if you are interested in reading the Amish Grace or the Two Krenda Casey Dean, you can go to Practice Discipleship, which is something you can follow on Facebook, and just get those links right there. Thomas did ask you, Colleen, sometimes youth see their failures as an omen that they will always fail, and some see only suicide as the answer. So how do you approach that?
Right. Right. Again, you know, I think that this is where a picture frame versus a path is really helpful.
Yes.
Because what's happening in that moment is they're feeling defined by their failures, and there's a lot of cultural support for that, right? You either
Yes.
frame it out or you frame it in. So you either pretend that it isn't there and you give a version of yourself in which you're wiped of every blemish, or you're labeled as a failure or the slow track or in need of help or something like that, and that's your box, right? So there's every cultural support for buying into the fact that you either have no flaws or that you're doomed to fail. But it isn't what Jesus offers. And what Jesus offers is so much more real to our human condition, because he acknowledges that we don't do everything perfectly. It's not actually possible to live without blemish, and we will fail. But God made us, and we are not doomed always to fail. So that if we can risk ourselves and step forward into a new beginning, even if we don't understand what it is, then God's grace is going before us, offering what's new and luring us into the good. And so just walking with those youth, saying, what is the path forward, or being honest about our own moments of failure and how we found a path forward is so important and so countercultural.
Wonderful. Thank you. Well, that's kind of a heavy thing to end on, but we are talking about a failure. So thank you for having a very successful webinar on failure. I'm going to hop in. So there's just a couple quick reminders as we head toward the top of the hour. This webinar, along with all the others in the series, has been recorded and is going to be archived on the Practice Discipleship website. That's www.practicediscipleship.org. So please, please download it. Use it wherever you see fit. Send it to volunteers, your church council, your adult forums, your colleagues, anyone who needs to hear what we were talking about today. You can also download from the Practice Discipleship site videos and curriculum from previous years to use in your congregation and networks. This is the third year of this initiative, so there is so much good information already there. Each synod in the ELCA has a Practice Discipleship coach who's been trained to offer seminars on these webinars locally in your own synod. So if you'd like to sort of have a live discussion on today's topic, you can do that in your synod. Training events are posted on the website, so keep checking back for updates. You can also find event dates on the network app for iPhone and Android. The free app gives you anytime access to videos, network news, a calendar of events, an interactive prayer wall, and much more. You can also, as I said earlier, follow us on Facebook and Twitter. So there's the address of the Facebook page. It's Practice Discipleship Initiative, and on Twitter it's ELCAPD. Our next webinar is a very long time from now, so we will send reminders, of course, but it's not until Thursday, September 11th at 1 o'clock Central. The title is Framing Christian Community with Josh Graber, and you can see the Practice Discipleship website for the remaining fall webinars. But put that on your calendar now so that you can really set aside that time and make sure that you don't schedule other things for September 11th. So thank you again, Colleen. It was so good. Thank you. And thank you all for being here. Oh, sorry. We need to work on our timing. I apologize. So we will see you in September. And thank you for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.